Comparing the iPad 9 to the iPad Air 4 might not be as simple as you think. I mean, the Air 4 does have the advantage in a lot of categories, but not all of them, and it's almost twice the price. So the question might not be which one is better, it should be which one is a better value and which one is a better fit for you. So let's take a look. Starting with dimensions, the physical size of the iPad Air 4 and the iPad 9 are very similar when we look at the overall footprint. The display on the Air 4 is slightly bigger and it's a completely different type of display, but we'll cover that later on in the video. Now, after using the iPad Air 4 and the iPad 9 with and without a case, putting them in different types of bags and then taking with me on the go, as far as portability, it's close enough to where I'm just gonna call it a tie. But when we look at the design, we start to see some major differences, both in aesthetics and functionality. The iPad Air 9 still has the exact same design elements as the previous model. We've got larger bezels on the top and the bottom, a home button with Touch ID for biometric authentication, volume up and down controls on the right, a power button at the top, and then a lightning port at the bottom with speakers on each side. The iPad Air 4 has a much more modern design with squared off edges, rounded corners, and smaller bezels all the way around. We've got the newer style power button at the top with integrated Touch ID. We have volume up and down controls on the right, a USB-C port on the bottom, and then there are speakers on the bottom and the top, which create a much better audio experience when you're watching content or playing games in landscape mode. And I'll talk about this more later on in the video because the iPad 9 has an advantage when it comes to gaming. Overall, the design is a win for the iPad Air 4. It looks nicer, it feels nicer to hold. I like the fact that we have smaller bezels all the way around. We've got a more powerful port, which is going to give us more powerful accessories, and we have a better configuration for the speakers. Now let's get to the screen, where we're going to see differences in size and the type of the display. Looking at the size, the iPad 9 has a 10.2-inch Retina display, and the iPad Air 4 has a 10.9-inch Liquid Retina display. So it's bigger, but not a huge difference. And while I do appreciate the added real estate, for the most part, I don't really notice a difference when I'm surfing the web, using productivity apps, multitasking, watching content, or gaming. I do hope that we get a redesign with the iPad 10 next year so that we can either get a smaller device with the same size screen or the same size device with a larger screen. Now, as far as resolution, the iPad 9 is 2160 by 1620 versus 2360 by 1640 on the iPad Air 4. Both have 264 pixels per inch, 500 nits of max brightness, and both are true tone displays. That means that both iPads are able to detect the color temperature of the light in your environment and then make changes to the display so that white always appears as white rather than yellow or blue. Now, the first major difference between the two is that the iPad Air 4 is a fully laminated display versus a non-laminated display on the iPad 9. That means that on the iPad Air 4, the cover glass, the touch layer, and the display are laminated into one display assembly where the image looks like it's painted on top of the glass. With the iPad 9, there's an air gap between the display and then the combination of the cover glass and touch layer. Now, when I'm watching content or playing games, it's not really something that I notice. On the iPad 8, I was able to more easily notice it when I'm looking at the edge because the one that I have has white bezels and then there's like a black strip in the gap. On the iPad 9, all models have black bezels, which do a better job of hiding the gap. Now, the one area where there's a more meaningful difference is when you're using the Apple Pencil. So on the iPad Air 4, it will look like the tip of the pencil is actually touching the line or the content that you're creating. Whereas on the iPad 9, you'll be able to see the separation. Now, when I'm taking notes, using the pencil for photo editing, or doing basic sketching and vector graphics, I have no issues using the iPad 9. But if you're a serious artist and this is the primary reason why you're getting a tablet, you will appreciate having a fully laminated display and the second generation Apple Pencil. Now, one other difference between the displays is that the iPad Air 4 is a DCI-P3 display versus sRGB on the iPad 9. And without nerding out too much about color, DCI-P3 is basically a wider color gamut that's able to more accurately reproduce colors in images and video. And finally, the iPad Air 4 has an anti-reflective coating, whereas the iPad 9 does not. So the Air 4 is a better iPad to use outside or in environments where you'll have to deal with bright lights reflecting off of your display. Now, to be fair, both are still quite reflective, so adding an anti-reflective screen cover will provide a much more drastic improvement in handling reflections. Now let's talk about the cameras, where it's a little bit of a split decision and there isn't a clear winner. And also, if you're getting value from this video, give it a thumbs up. And then if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Starting with the rear-facing camera, the iPad Air 4 has the edge with a 12-megapixel f1.8 camera with Smart HDR3 for photos, versus an 8-megapixel f2.4 camera on the iPad 9 with HDR for photos. So with the iPad Air 4, we're getting higher resolution photos, better low-light performance, and better post-processing for HDR. When we look at video, the iPad Air 4 can record 1080p at up to 60 frames per second, versus only 30 frames per second on the iPad 9. The Air 4 can also shoot higher resolution 4K video at up to 60 frames per second, whereas the iPad 9 can't do 4K at all. And then finally, the Air 4 can shoot slow motion at 1080p versus 720p on the iPad 9, and it can do that at up to 240 frames per second versus 120 on the iPad 9. So this means that slow motion footage on the Air 4 is going to be both higher resolution and it can be slowed down by twice as much. So basically, if you plan on using the rear-facing camera on your iPad, the iPad Air 4 is the clear winner. However, when we look at the front-facing camera, then the iPad 9 has the advantage with a 12-megapixel f2.4 ultra-wide camera versus a 7-megapixel f2.2 on the iPad Air 4. The iPad 9 can use the 2x zoom-out capabilities of this new camera for a feature called Center Stage. Basically, it can use artificial intelligence to identify and then track a subject, and it can zoom in and out to make it look like the camera is either panning or tilting to follow the subject. You can use this feature for video calls with FaceTime or Zoom, or even for making TikTok videos. When it comes to audio, the iPad 9 has speakers just on the bottom, and the iPad Air 4 has speakers on the top and the bottom. So when you're holding it in landscape mode, you're getting stereo sound. When you hold the iPad 9 in landscape mode, then you're only getting sound to come out of one side. Overall, the iPad Air 4 sounds much more rich and full, and it's a noticeable difference. So if you plan on using the speakers a lot, it definitely has the advantage. If you're looking to use headphones, then the iPad 9 comes with a 3.5mm headphone jack, whereas on the iPad Air 4, you'll need a USB-C to 3.5mm adapter. When you're watching content, using an adapter or a hub is not a big deal, but I'll talk about this more when we get to gaming, because in that case, there is a huge difference. We talked a little bit about the Apple Pencil functionality when we compared the displays, but on top of that, the iPad Air 4 uses the second generation Apple Pencil versus the first generation on the iPad 9. Now, both work great and are very similar in regards to the actual feel of the contact point with the glass. The first generation Apple Pencil has to be paired by plugging it into the Lightning port. It can be charged through the port as well or with an adapter. The pencil itself is round and there's no way to store it on the iPad 9. The second generation Apple Pencil has a flat edge, so it's more comfortable to hold, at least in my opinion, and it can also be paired, charged, and stored magnetically on the side of the iPad Air 4. Another thing you can do with the second generation pencil is assign a function to the double tap feature, so you could use it to switch between tools, switch between your current tool and the eraser, or bring up the color palette. To summarize, both pencils work well, but if you want the best experience with an Apple Pencil, that would be the second generation pencil with the iPad Air 4. When it comes to keyboards, if you want a Magic Keyboard, that's only going to be available with the iPad Air 4. If you're looking for other options, including third-party keyboard cases, then there are a ton of choices for both iPads, and both can also be paired with an external keyboard and a mouse. Moving on, one of the upgrades that we got with the iPad 9 is the introduction of the A13 Bionic chip, which in this case we're putting up against the A14 on the iPad Air 4. I'm going to be talking about multitasking and gaming in a minute, but very quickly, for those of you who are interested in benchmark scores, for single core performance, the iPad Air 4 scored 1582 versus 1330 on the iPad 9, and for multi-core performance, the iPad Air 4 scored 4281 versus 3376. So in both cases, the iPad Air 4 comes out ahead. When I'm actually using these devices for the most common tasks like surfing the web, working with different productivity apps, taking notes, or watching content, there isn't really much of a difference. Like, both iPads have plenty of processing power. When we get to photo editing, again, both are very similar, and it's only when we come to the most demanding tasks like rendering video that I may notice a meaningful difference. The one major advantage of the iPad Air 4 when it comes to video editing has to do with the USB-C port at the bottom. It's a more powerful port, and it allows us to power faster and more capable external SSD drives. And with LumaFusion, you can actually edit right off of the SSD without having to copy the video files onto the iPad Air 4. This is not possible with the iPad 9. This means that with the Air 4, you're not really using the internal storage for your video clips, and if your SSD fills up, you can offload it to a slower backup device. I also tested multi-app workflows with all the new multitasking capabilities of iPadOS 15, and although the iPad Air 4 has 4 gigs of RAM and the iPad 9 has 3 gigs, I didn't really notice any significant differences in starting, switching between, or closing apps. And no matter which apps I had open at the same time, both iPads were very responsive. Both also worked really well for me with Sidecar, so if I wanted to use them as an additional external display for my MacBook, Mac, or iMac, I had no issues. Now, because the size of the display is very similar, I'm not going to give either one of them the edge in that context, and if you want to learn more about Sidecar as a feature, check out that video right there. Before I get to gaming, let's quickly talk about battery life. Both iPads are rated for 10 hours of surfing the web on Wi-Fi or watching video, and then 9 hours when using cellular data. Now, I've been running some tests, and so far, the iPad 9 may be ever so slightly ahead of the Air 4 in terms of battery life, but I'll publish my final results in a follow-up video. When it comes to gaming, both iPads were a ton of fun. As far as startup time for games, the two devices were quite similar, and even during gameplay, I wasn't really able to notice a major difference between the two. I played all my usual games, including Call of Duty Mobile and then PUBG with frame rate set to extreme, and both iPads did great. I also paired my Xbox controller with both iPads, and I played different games using Xbox Game Pass, and in both cases, gameplay was smooth and the devices were responsive and showed no lag as long as I had a fast internet connection. When it comes to gaming audio, again, it's a split decision because if you're using speakers, then the iPad Air 4 wins easily. The audio quality is better, and the stereo speakers make it easier to detect which detection a sound is coming from. So this way, when someone's trying to sneak up on you, you can be ready. Now, if you want to use wired headphones or a wired headset, which is always my preference, then the iPad 9 wins because it has a 3.5mm headphone jack in the corner. With the iPad Air 4, you can use an adapter or a hub, but if you're playing a game while holding the device, then the hub or the adapter can get in the way because it could be exactly where you want to place your hands. Now let's talk about the configuration options, and then we can get to my recommendations. So both are offered in 64 or 256 gigs of internal storage. The iPad 9 sells for $329 and $479, and the iPad Air 4 sells for $599 or $749. The iPad Air 4 also has better wireless connectivity options with Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.0 versus Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth 4.2 on the iPad 9, and both offer cellular models which support 4G LTE. Now let's get to my recommendations, and remember that I have links in the description to all the products that I talked about. So the iPad Air 4 has a more premium design with smaller bezels and upgraded Touch ID, a more powerful port, it has speakers on both sides, a fully laminated display with more accurate color reproduction, a better stylus user experience with the second generation Apple Pencil, Magic Keyboard compatibility, a better rear-facing camera, a more powerful processor, and more RAM. The iPad 9 offers a similar experience for most general use cases like watching content, surfing the web, or for multitasking. It has a better front-facing camera, plenty of processing power for the majority of users, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and it's significantly less expensive. Hopefully this video helped you make a decision. Click on my face to subscribe and then watch this comparison between the iPad mini 6 and the iPad Air 4. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.